Hey guys, Lou Perez here with We the Internet TV, and it's a very special day. That's why I'm dressed like someone attending a vampire's funeral. I had to dress up a little bit because I need to take some attention away from the fantastic guest that I have on this program. To my right, you may remember her from our series Sex, Gender, and Bullshit. She's a columnist for Playboy and Globe and Mail, and tomorrow there's a piece about her in Penthouse magazine, Dr. Debra Soh. Oh, we don't have an audience here, so no one's clapping. My bad. To my left, he's a undergraduate at Columbia University and a columnist for Quillette, Mr. Coleman Hughes. And then to Coleman's left, my favorite, one of my collaborators, director, co-writer for We the Internet TV, Mr. Boris Khaykin. Everybody, Boris. Cool. So we're gonna get things started, guys. No matter what. What platform you're watching us on, please send questions and we'll try to get to them over the course of the event. I'm going to call it an event. Why not?
It's an event. It's
Yeah,
eventful.
It's eventful. Cool. So I just want to start things off. Debra, recently you wrote a piece called "In Academia, Censorship and Conformity Have Become the Norm." So what are some things that you're not allowed to talk about in academia?
I think a good question is, what are we allowed to talk about at all anymore? So I wrote my column. There's news recently about the Journal of Controversial Ideas. So this journal is going to allow academics to publish their papers under a pseudonym. So this was presented as some sort of, it's been portrayed as a way for, say, far-right people to gain acceptance for their supposed horrible ideas. But in fact, most of the censorship that's been happening in academia is by liberals censoring other liberals, or I would say probably more like far-left academics and activists censoring liberal researchers. So one of the examples I talked about was rapid onset gender dysphoria, this phenomenon of adolescent girls that are coming out as transgender even though they've had no previous history of gender dysphoria. The first study on this was published a couple months ago, and as a result of activist backlash, the paper was, the press release was pulled, and the academic journal that published it has actually put it under review, even though it was peer-reviewed before going out. So that's just one of many, many issues nowadays that researchers can't even ask legitimate questions about, and it's kind of a scary time.
Yeah, when I first heard about the Journal of Controversial Ideas, I thought it was like a total joke. Like I thought it was just like.
It sounds like satire.
Yeah, it sounds like a sketch we would do at We the Internet TV. Yeah. So, well, Coleman. I mean, you're currently in college. You're at Columbia. You're okay with this? Well, I just said it. So anyone wants to find you, they can go uptown.
I have a Twitter. I mean, I'm public.
You are public. I didn't just find you.
Do you think you're outing me as a Columbia student?
I might. I might have thought that going into it. But well, on a recent episode of the Fifth Column, you talked about what you're allowed to say. There's like a classroom component and like a social component. Now, as a student, have you experienced anything like sort of in the academic realm that I was talking about?
Well, yeah, the classroom component is, there are certain fields, gender studies being probably the best example, sociology to a degree, urban studies to a degree, American studies to a degree, that you can major in these fields and take class after class with a professor that will be teaching you what to think instead of how to think. I've only taken one of these classes at Columbia because I tend to avoid those subjects, but based on that class, I mean, there was one point in the class where the teacher would curse at us for not knowing enough about the U.S. bail system before we had learned that material.
Curse at you?
Yeah, she said, if you don't know about the bail system, you're part of the effing problem. She said this to the class of students, and it was just to shame us, right? Mm-hmm. Like we had not yet done that unit.
You hadn't been arrested yet.
Hadn't been arrested.
That's so.
No, but I mean, at another point she said, all students of color are victims of oppression by definition. Like, this is a white woman. I'm a black kid in that class disagreeing. Like, what are you talking about? That's not true of my experience. It's not true of many other quote people of color that I know. But the environment was so repressive that I can only analogize it to being at a funeral where you know the person who's died is a total dick, but you can't say so because you're at the funeral for that person.
It's basically going to be my funeral.
Probably. But no, it really, there are classrooms that are that repressive, and they're disproportionately located in certain subjects, which I stay away from. And really, it's on the professors in those classes. It's on them to create an open environment, and it's their fault when they don't. But then I separate that out from the social component, which is just hanging out with friends. Most people aren't thinking about politics all the time, but occasionally you're hanging out with someone, the conversation turns to politics, and the background assumption in almost every case is that America is a racist patriarchy, essentially. That's the background framing. Those are the priors that most students are bringing to conversations about politics, even if they're not the caricature of a blue-haired social justice warrior. That's just the water in which one swims at Columbia. So I do think it's problematic. I think the Journal of Controversial Ideas seems like a bad solution to a real problem.
Why
Right.
would you say? I was going to say, why would you say it's a bad solution?
Well, I don't know. It's just
I had that impulse, too.
Pseudonyms, it doesn't seem like the way to go. I understand the impulse for it, but it just, something about the incentives, like we know on social media, part of the reason things are so nasty is because people don't have to pay a price.
Anonymity.
Yeah, anonymity. I don't know, something about anonymity seems like the wrong route to go.
Are you
It also seems like unfeasible.
afraid, I guess, that some researchers will abuse that then and they will publish ideas that are really distasteful because they can get away with it?
I don't know.
I think the opposite. Like, it separates the conversations where, like, it still feels like a barrier to having an open conversation because you're still kind of doing it in this other context. And then if you want to bring it into an open conversation, it either has to be like a big deal where you come out and as like, I'm the guy that's been anonymously commenting on this thing, and now it's just an additional barrier to the conversation where like, okay, well, let's look through all the stuff you've said as this anonymous person and do research on it before we can. It just doesn't feel like a real.
If it does take off, you know that there is going to be a point where, you know, somebody, you know, hacks into the system and like finds out who really wrote the stuff,
Yeah.
and then
Right,
like,
if
it's probably
Ashley Madison got called out.
right, and especially any academics who are trying to, you know, cheat on their spouses through this.
Yeah.
It's like a really.
First, Ashley Madison ruined it. Now their political views.
Right. And also, I wonder just the point, like, how do you pick your name? Like, I just wonder. Like,
You go on one of those automatic generators.
and they just.
Like what, Wu-Tang Clan
Name generator,
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
Whatever. Yeah, I mean, I can't picture the New York Times covering a study conducted by anonymous authors whose...
Although they will post anonymous sources, I
Right.
guess, right?
I think in an ideal world, what you're saying, Boris, we wouldn't need a journal like this.
Right.
And I agree. I think it would be more conducive to be able to have these conversations. Like when I think about myself as a journalist, the things I've written about, I would probably, if I had the choice of being anonymous, I probably would live in fear now of what happens when people figure out who I am. But I've always been open about who I am. So you don't have that worry, I guess, which is very freeing.
That's
But
a huge thing.
It is, but I think, Coleman, to your point, I guess having been in the academy, and you are too, but I think the way to do it is to, if someone does want to abuse it, to have that open discussion, have other academics publish papers that say, hey, that's not okay, and this is why we disagree.
Yeah, I guess my concern is less the academics abusing anonymity, now that I'm thinking about it out loud, more that I can't see the journalistic world taking it seriously when they can't put a name on the research. And I feel like in order to break these taboos, like the taboo around sex differences, for example, I can't see the Atlantic or the New York Times publishing a study that really should be covered, or covering a study rather, when there's no researcher to name or reach out
Right.
to or verify the credentials of. I don't know. Again, it's an.
We know,
I don't know
you know,
how
on the point of where, you know, identity politics plays such a big role in how one is perceived, or what one has to say, like as far as their work in politics or science of law. It's almost like anonymity might actually give a certain layer, might take away that layer of judgment,
Or it's
initial
just
judgment.
ideas.
Yeah.
But you know, that also feels like a self-fulfilling prophecy to me because it sounds like a thing that's going to attract in academia probably people more to the right, or at least that don't adhere to like the like left-wing orthodoxy, and it actually feels like it might backfire in the sense that I find that I learn a lot having conversations with people that think differently than me. And so if you have a group of people that none of which belong to the left-leaning orthodoxy of academia, calling out some of the parts that might be, you know, BS of the guys that are on there or the girls that are on there, you're going to have a little bit of like a bubble to the right in this anonymous thing. And then you might actually, it might be like a self-fulfilling prophecy where you have more bad ideas to the right fester because you don't have people who disagree with that calling it out because they don't want to be part of that anonymous conversation because they don't have to be because
Right.
they can express their stuff
in
publicly.
their defense, and I'm not the official spokesperson for this journal, I keep defending it, but
Well,
I think
you might be, but
I
you
think
might
it
be
is a good idea.
anonymous.
True. Watch me start publishing in there. But what was I saying? It's open to a politically diverse range of authors. So I
Right.
think the editorial board is really pushing for that as well.
You know what? I'm putting myself in the mindset of a hardcore progressive that sees, let's say you published a paper talking about biological gender differences, and I'm a hardcore progressive looking at this paper, and it's anonymous. I instantly think it's by a guy, and I'm instantly going to write it off as just another attempt to justify the patriarchy. But if your name, Debra Soh, was on it, I would have to rethink this because this was written by a woman. Maybe I have to actually look at it. Maybe she's
a
not
traitor
just
to her
yeah.
gender and race.
So I'm like the anonymity might, from an optics point of view, do the opposite of what we might want it to.
Well,
right?
Deborah, you've actually had, you know, that experience. I mean, the stuff that you do cover. I wonder, you know, you being a woman, does that give you any cover? You know?
I think for most rational people, it might. Like, I don't like identity politics. I don't think it should make a difference. I think if I were a man, or if I were white, it shouldn't make a difference in terms of Donald. It shouldn't make a difference in terms of what I say because the science stands on its own. But I think, say, for progressives who are empathic and probably do think sexism is a serious problem in society because that's what they're being told, if they see a woman saying the things that I say, they might be a little more open to listening than if it were a man. But I think for people who are really, really bent on identity politics and believe that the world is a horrible patriarchy and women are oppressed and
Just internalized misogyny.
internalized misogyny and that I'm selling out for the patriarchy. So you can't really get through to those people. But those aren't the people that I'm trying to speak to anyway.
Well, you know, just going back to the idea of, you know, what is, you know, the purpose of education and university to have like tough, complicated discussions. I look back on, I went to NYU, and I think the most important class that I ever had in college was called Belief and Skepticism. And I think one of the first days that we were there, we had to split up into believers and skeptics. And of course, all the cool kids were on the skeptic side. So they all went over there. And then I decided, I was like, well, you know, I think there is some truth out there, so I'll be on the believer side. And we were supposed to have a debate. And I posed the first question that I posed, or the first statement I said was, rape is wrong. And this was back in college where I don't think you could have that conversation. And the other side, the skeptics, had to challenge that and were trying, you know, to refute that. And, you know, being able to have that very harsh, you know, a discussion about something so awful, but trying to, you know, to rationalize it and come up with the best arguments possible was super helpful for not only in that class, but you know, what ended up taking me, you know, throughout, you know, my academics and all that.
Yeah, I'm part of this great club at Columbia called Colloquia, and we do that every Friday. We split the room in half arbitrarily and just argue some proposition, and then halfway through we switch sides. It's the only club like that at Columbia, and we just started, and we're trying to, you know, broaden our platform. And but yeah, no, they're really, it's crazy how much of the academic culture is the opposite of that. So when I go to the Colloquia every Friday and do these meetings, it's like so refreshing because I don't get to do this in conversation with people. I don't get to do this in class for the most part. So it sticks out by contrast with the formal curriculum.
That's great. It just like separates morality away from just intellectually sparring about a thing.
Yeah, because there is, you know, the, you know, this idea that, to understand the reasons for, the arguments for terrible ideas doesn't mean that you actually have those ideas. It means that you have the tools to actually process what those ideas are, and then you're able to I guess, defeat them in some way.
Yeah, there's a lot of really smart people with terrible conclusions, and like, you can still learn a lot and improve your ability to like fight against those conclusions by arguing that type of stuff. Yeah. And obviously people avoid it all the time now. I grew up like just arguing in my family, and I feel like it just made it so that I can just question stuff easier, and I don't know, there's something so valuable to it, and now people avoid that kind of like energy. There's just like...
Before we went live, Coleman and I were talking about someone who we respect a lot, named Glenn Lowry, and Glenn has a show called The Glenn Show with Blogging Heads, which I think is from the New York Times or something like that. And one of the things that we talk about him is that his ability to steel man someone's argument, where straw man is it's the opposite of straw manning. It is presenting the strongest argument possible for your opponent, or being able to repeat back to them what their argument is, and then using that to go with the conversation. And so many times, whether it's online or when I watch debates, it's like that's just not happening at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love doing that. Especially because like, living in New York, most of my friends are like on the left in Brooklyn, and then I have friends in Jersey that are on the right. And I'll play both sides and I'll argue with them without really ever being like, I actually feel this way, just because like sometimes I really don't know what I think yet, and my perspective on it will be so much stronger just like sincerely fighting with both sides and trying to like figure out where their best arguments are.
Yeah, I also recommend steel manning as a tactic to diffuse arguments that are going off the rails. This has happened to me a lot recently with some friends, or more acquaintances, someone I just met that we're now talking about politics, and I can tell that it's about to go wrong. And sometimes when I have the mental fortitude, I just stop what I'm doing and just try to say their argument better than they've been saying it. And if I succeed, which I don't always, usually that diffuses it and the rest of the conversation goes well.
Because they see that you actually understand them maybe even better than they understand their own point of view.
Yeah, I really highly recommend this to people who get in arguments that go foul often. It really works.
How often do you find people do that for you, that they try to give you the benefit of the doubt and really understand where you're coming from?
Not often. Not often.
Yeah. Because I find that's a common thing. I think if you are able to take the other person's perspective and give them the benefit of the doubt, that shows that you really do understand where you're coming from. Because if you're not even considering where they're coming from, how do you know that you're right?
Right, totally.
And it's also, the idea of perceiving the worst in other people, like that people are coming at a subject with the worst of intentions, as opposed to just trying to figure stuff out and all that. And we actually have a question from the audience. And Deborah, you could probably take this one. What needs to be done to stop the politicization? Can you read it?
What needs to be done to stop the politicization of science?
Cool. Do you want to talk about?
Yeah, I can start. I think the biggest thing is that you have to start within the academy. So I think professors need to take a stand. And I think it's honestly the majority of professors. Like, we see kind of these scary ideas coming into STEM now. It used to be just in the humanities, but I see it coming into the hard sciences now. These really unscientific ideas infiltrating. And I think people are too afraid to say anything, but it's slowly taking over. So I think it has to start with professors. But I think everyone, even if you aren't in academia, we can all make a difference in that way. Even in conversations you have with your friends or colleagues, family members. I know it can get ugly, but I don't think there's any alternative, because otherwise everyone stays silent together and nothing changes.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys have read this book, but Alice Drager has a book called Galileo's Middle Finger. And if you guys haven't read it, you have to read it. And Alice is one of those people who is not afraid to question, orthodoxy and what's happening, particularly in the sciences and also the social sciences too. And her whole book is about I guess would you call it debunking certain?
I guess getting the myths straight
Right.
and on both sides. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would totally recommend that.
There's also this, I read in Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, that some people say that the worst thing that ever happened to the climate science conversation was Al Gore making an inconvenient truth, branding climate change as a left-wing issue, when in principle it's not political at all.
Practically, right.
So maybe there's something to be said for scientists getting out ahead of politicians and trying to get a narrative out there that's nonpartisan before politicians get to any given issue.
True. I like what you said also, just like starting and arguing with family, because that's like the safest place. I mean, it should be the safest place where you can disagree and still love each other. And it's ironic to me that, like, on the one hand, it's young people that are probably the most susceptible to these types of things, but yet it's older people that also have the most to lose in standing up a lot of times. Like, if I'm going to empathize with somebody that might want to keep their mouth shut in academia, it's like, well, what do I worry about this, or do I worry about making sure that I got like kids at home and whatever else, and that I can pay the bills and I got a job? Like, that it feels hard to be brave under that scenario when you have a lot to lose and a lot of people depending on you.
I think too, I mean, I've been talking about Me Too a lot lately, and I think women especially need to speak out if they're not okay with the direction things are going in with that whole narrative and how that is, like, feminism is overtaking the academy. We need to say something, because if men say it, men get people disregard what they say because, well, you're a white man, of course you're going to say that.
Right.
Were you just about to say something?
No, I'm gonna keep my mouth shut
No,
as
I
a
think
white
it's
man right now.
no, I think it's just, I feel the same way about I know, partially because I hear from them, there are many black people who don't feel comfortable with the progressive narrative about race right now. And there is, even though this doesn't make sense and it shouldn't be the case, there is more value in a black person coming forward and saying, this is what I think, even if a white person says the same thing, because just given how irrational we are about race, the black person saying it will get more traction, and it will be seen more charitably by the people who need convincing on the issue. So I would just, obviously it's easier to say be courageous than it is to be courageous, but
Boris and I, we actually worked on a sketch. The idea, it's a surrogacy program where if you're a straight white man and you have ideas that you're not supposed to have, this service will grant you, say for example, a black person to take your place and say the same exact thing.
Yeah.
And then it's okay.
Yeah.
I remember when I was a kid, it might be a little different, but I always loved, like, anytime we went to like a punk rock concert, seeing like the one or two like black kids, it was like, whoa, maybe punk is cool.
Well, punk was like historically super anti-racism.
Right. Yeah.
That was like where punching Nazis
Bad
originally came
Brains
from.
and
Yeah.
those guys. Well, maybe we can use this as a way to segue into the whole idea of anti-racism. I know John McWhorter, who's a professor, a linguistics professor at Columbia University, has called anti-racism a religion.
Yeah.
For those of you who haven't, heard the term, anti-racism, what is it exactly?
yeah, well,
And I'm going to you on this one. So
yeah, no, it's okay. So obviously it's good to be against racism.
Sure. I think we can all agree. We're all cool with that.
Let's steel man this for a
Yeah.
second.
So being against racism isn't what is meant by anti-racist. To be anti-racist is to define yourself as someone who is against racism, who is for progressive orthodoxies around race. And I mean, like, how many people do you know who define themselves as anti-pedophiles? Right? You don't hear that. Obviously,
those are normally the guys you have to watch
Those
out
are definitely
for.
the pedophiles.
Exactly. So I think we should have a similar suspicion about anti-racism. Not that anti-racists are themselves secret racists, necessarily, although we can go there. Just that John McWhorter's idea is that anti-racism has become kind of a religion. So if an alien came to Earth and studied the phenomenon of religion, they would see Christianity and Islam and Hinduism, and they would not put those faiths in a different category than modern anti-racism. So you have your saints like Ta-Nehisi Coates, and
Peace be unto him.
the style of, I mean, there's one quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's something like, marking the moment of awakening to the history of racism in America. Marking the moment of awakening is like marking the moment of falling in love, right? That's the kind of thing you would expect to hear in a seeker's memoir, a spiritual memoir, Augustine or something. Not something you'd expect to hear in social analysis of a phenomenon. So it's religious in that respect. It's religious in the sense that there's blasphemy. We don't call something blasphemous, we call it problematic. If you have an opinion about race that isn't in the mainstream. The way we treat history is similar to how religions treat history. Just like Christian people don't study the history of Jesus once and then forget about it like we do when we study World War I in school. They go back every Sunday and learn the same story over and over again. Similarly, if you read the New York Times every day, you will learn about the history of lynching. Once every couple months, there'll be another article about it, even though it's a decades-old crime. You'll hear something about Emmett Till every few months. Obviously, this is a history that everyone should know, but why doesn't the New York Times ever publish anything about the fact that homicide is the #1 cause of death for black men age 15 to 34, and it's not for any other race? You just don't know. Nobody knows this fact. It's perfectly mainstream. It's CDC. But you won't hear that ever mentioned. You'll hear lynching mentioned, even though every year more black people die from homicide than ever died from lynching in this country. So anti-racism, the core idea is that it's become a religion. It's become more about white people reforming themselves and purging themselves of any ounce of racism
And
than
accepting
about.
ultimate sin, sort of. I think I remember.
So instead of
original
sin,
original sin,
instead of
right.
original sin, it's white privilege.
Right,
Really, it's
exactly.
this thing that you can never be cleansed of. You must constantly apologize for.
But by accepting it, you're like,
You're sort of saved.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, you're up in Canada. When you look down upon us, from,
We don't look down on you guys.
you know,
South.
when you look south,
You look south upon us.
with like the anti-racism stuff, is that a part of like Canadian culture at all? Has it become?
It has. It's definitely been coming up to us. I wrote recently about cultural appropriation, and I was really surprised at how angry people got about it. I think ultimately, with any subject that is considered controversial, we need to be able to talk openly about it. So in the event that, say, someone is racist, I think the best way to handle that is to challenge them and say, why is it that you hold those views? As someone who is a visible minority, I would rather know that someone holds those views than them hide it away or take it behind closed doors because they know it's not socially acceptable. Because that's the only way you change minds. But I do feel in Canada, because we are a little bit more, we're known for being polite, so people hide their racist views a little more, but then people are also a little bit more afraid to call someone out.
I mean, if I had a choice, I'd want to meet a polite racist as opposed to.
If you're going to be
They
racist,
apologize
at least have
first.
some manners.
Just be
about it.
polite about it. Say the N-word, then follow it with please and
Well,
thank you.
it's funny, the flip side of that also is like it's the only way you could change minds, or just like not deal with those people.
Yeah.
Like sometimes you can change minds, but I'd also like to know who might hate me because of who I am, so I could just like go to a different place and not be around them.
I think, or it might have been earlier this year. I think I don't know if it was an Asian man, an Asian gay man brought a lawsuit against a gay dating app because within the app you're allowed to choose what you're into. So if you were into just white guys or something like that, you could put that. So I think quite a few profiles said like Asian men need not apply, or
Something like no rice, no spice is a common
Oh,
thing.
is
they'll
that what
put.
they
Wow.
said?
Yeah, to specifically say they will only date certain races.
Yeah. So this guy was bringing a lawsuit, and I saw quite a few of my friends saying like, "Oh, this is, yeah, screw that, that app and all that." It's like, when you're talking about something as intimate as dating, or in this, I think this app is more of like a hookup app, right? It's like, don't you want to know? Like, don't you want to make it clear, like, okay, this person is not worthy of my time.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Also-
an app. Like, numbers are the name of the game. If from my app days, it's like
Just
you're not trying to waste a bunch of time talking to somebody
Just
for
keep
10
swiping
minutes.
right.
If you know later on, that's why all the girls on their profiles have like, must be 5'10", I wear heels, I'm 5'2", but
Yeah, that
he's got to
one-
be
that one
5'10".
kills me. But it also, like, what is the concern? Because if you're an Asian guy, you want them to not be able to screen you out. so that you match with someone who hates Asian? Is that the goal?
Waste
Is it
both
to
of your
match with
time?
more people that
think-
don't want anything to do with you?
I think well, I don't know where this person is coming from, but my understanding, I think, is this idea that Asian men are kind of desexualized by media, so why is there further perpetuation of that on dating apps? Like, is that fair for Asian men? I mean, I'm kind of mixed. I have mixed feelings about it. I don't think you should tell people what they should be into sexually. I think people have their preferences and they should be allowed to have those preferences. But I also do understand the other side of it, that it's not fun to be discriminated against.
So is it like basically, do you treat it as an editorial issue where they have, like if somebody was writing outward racist stuff, if somebody had slurs on their dating profile, I'd imagine they'd probably do something about it, right? It crosses over into editorial at some point, right?
Yeah. Well, what's the spice part? I get the no rice.
Brown people.
Oh yeah.
Oh.
Right.
I didn't make it up, just to be clear.
Right. Because
Oh.
white people are notorious for not having spice in their flavor in their food. So, when I was single, I went on a few dates with a woman, and we were at a restaurant. It came time to pay, and I paid, and I asked for a copy of the receipt, and she told me, she was like, "Oh, what are you, Jewish?" And I was like, "Whoa, this is some low-key anti-Semitism." It totally turned me off. And it's like, I wish I would have known that before we went on this date. You know, I'd rather not, be with an anti-Semite. Just so I'm, maybe she could have put like no challah or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm Jewish and I can see myself making a joke like that, but I guess it's okay for me.
Well, it was weird because I'm not Jewish,
Right.
So I was like, sort of standing up.
It's almost like
Yeah.
a weird thing where, like, since
I was-
neither of you are Jewish, it's a weird thing to say because the context is like neither of us have a very clear benefit of the doubt yet. So if you're not anti-Semitic, it's a weird thing to throw out there and just assume we're both going to be cool with it.
Yeah, it would have been another level if she's like, "What are you, a Zionist?" Like that would have been like, "Whoa."
That would have been like very specific.
Really specific. Like, wow, that's crazy. I don't know if you guys ever heard of this example, but there was a recent study that came out that says that white liberals present themselves as less competent in interactions with African Americans. So they found that liberal individuals were less likely to use words that would make them appear highly competent when the person they were addressing was presumed to be black rather than white. We could probably bring that up.
Yeah, was this Yale or Harvard?
I think it was Yale.
It was Yale, yeah.
And just, this is just how I speak. Like, I have a limited
No, I
vocabulary.
can tell
I'm
you're-
not, this is who I am, and all that. I'm not changing it up.
There's
Just
actually a
do that.
big body of literature that finds things like this. There's one from the Cornell professor, David Pizarro, which I think is really interesting and funny, where they asked subjects if they would sacrifice, I think, one life to save 100. It's kind of one of those utilitarian dilemmas in philosophy. But in one group, they name the sacrificial victim Chip Ellsworth III. So this just very waspy sounding name. And in the other group, they name him something like Tyrone Payton or Tyrone Smith, stereotypically black name. They find progressives are more likely to sacrifice the person when they have the white sounding name, but conservatives are even-handed, which I think is interesting.
Yeah.
Although you don't want to extrapolate too much from one or two studies.
Right.
But yeah, there is that kind of,
Well, I guess in that study, if you're black, you want those allies who aren't going to sacrifice.
yeah.
But I guess the whole like,
If I'm Tyrone,
yeah, it's like, oh, thank God.
yeah.
It's
yeah,
so interesting though because like from a progressive standpoint, you're linking systemic oppression to this like very specific analytical like moral exercise that should technically be like outside of all that, right? You're not really saying like it is America, this is the year, this is the situation, do you pull the lever and move the train? But like I think that really relates to I have a lot of conversations I feel like where people use like systemic oppression in a one-on-one conversation where it's like, but that has nothing to do with this. This is you personally behaving in a particular way. The way that like our districts are zoned for voting has nothing to do with you being a jerk right now because this person's this race, you know?
Right. And I do wonder how many people give the answer that they feel like they're supposed to give, as opposed to if it was sort of like, I don't know if it was like a double-blind, sort of a test, and whether or not.
Well, no, they test to see if people are aware of their own bias,
Oh, okay.
and they're not. Yeah, which is the most interesting part of it. But I think it does tie into the anti-racism as a religion conversation, because you're dividing the world into classes of people with different sort of like moral starting. You're starting from different places of moral value. Like black people just kind of are given the benefit of the doubt as moral beings worthy of and virtue. I guess it's a virtue. As a measure of virtue, black people start out ahead, white people start out behind, men start out behind women, and so given
Especially
that
when you're chasing them, just creepily following them. Sorry.
yeah, given that framework, it makes perfect sense to sacrifice Chip over Tyrone, because Chip just is, as a moral being, he's starting out behind Tyrone in your worldview.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess we could probably move into the discussion of affirmative action and what's happening, where now it's sort of like Tyrone has been given. So Tyrone is above Chip, and I don't know what.
Tyrone's an Asian guy in this example?
Is he an Asian
He's
guy?
Thai.
No, like
Thai dash.
one of my good friends, Dave
There you
Kim, from back in the day, a Korean dude. So it's like Tyrone is also above Chip and Dave. So when it comes to affirmative action, and you've written about affirmative action, especially how it relates to Harvard University, and can you tell us about that?
Right, so for decades now, Harvard has been discriminating against Asian American applicants, requiring them to have SAT scores that are hundreds of points higher than other racial groups. And for the applicants who do meet that criterion, they are then penalized in terms of personality rankings, which are subjective. So Asian applicants are seen as less likable or less respectable. And
So it's sort of like Harvard is kind of like a dating app, in a way.
Swiping left.
Swiping left on Asian applicants.
So, my issue with it, I think it's important to offer support to groups that may be disadvantaged but I don't think it's appropriate to frame that as diversity and inclusion to hold back a group that's doing well. I don't think that's fair. It's blatant racism. But I'm absolutely amazed at how, I consider myself to be liberal, but how progressives seem totally okay with this.
How do you draw the line there between trying to help someone who's disadvantaged, and whether it's like turning it into legislature, turning it into act, you have to be able to somehow explicitly state how you're going to do that and how those rules work. I'm like relating it in my head to where I'm from in the USSR. They had limits for Jews in a lot of different schools, and it was a lot of it was under, what's that?
We did here too for a long time.
In America?
Yeah, until the 70s.
I gotta learn and bank on that sweet
In
oppression.
the Ivy Leagues, they had limits on Jews.
Yeah.
Harvard,
Actually,
yeah.
What was it? Harvard Ties, was it? The Brendan Fraser.
School ties.
School ties. That was what that was about. But yeah, how do you if you have an actual situation where you're trying to do good and you're trying to help people that have been systematically oppressed, and you're trying to turn that into explicit written rules, how do you do that without it turning into these rules now favor somebody explicitly based on race?
Well, now, and now something that you're seeing in New York City, we have Mayor de Blasio wants to make some of the the specialized high schools in New York. He wants to open those up to more Hispanic and Black students who are who don't make up a large enough percentage of the student body. So at schools like Bronx Science and Stuyvesant. So ultimately, I think the way it's been working is there's like one test that you take, and then off that one test, you get into these specialized high schools. And if you don't get in, and that's basically it. And now they want to make it so that if you come in like one of the top of your class or something like that, they want to ease the requirements to get into these schools.
The New York Times editorial board a few months ago ran a piece on this, and there was one throwaway sentence in there that said that many of the Asian students, Asian families whose kids get into Stuyvesant and Bronx Science, something like, quote, scrimp on essentials like food in order to pay for test prep.
Right, they're not well off. They're just putting everything they got.
Scrimping on food.
Scrimping on
Right, this
food.
was in the same article that was clearly taking de Blasio's side and arguing that Asians, for some reason, are fundamentally incomparable to other groups of people, so that when Asians tend to be disproportionately successful despite coming here with very little, we should still view it as okay to say, well, blacks and Hispanics need help that Asians don't need. Blacks and Hispanics can't be expected to do the same things there, so we need to change the whole standards.
Yeah, and I read another article that described it as gaming the system. That you have Asians who are gaming the system for this test by prepping for the test, and that's part of gaming the system. And I'm from New York originally. I'm from Queens. I ended up going to a Catholic high school, so I never took the test. But but I'm totally prepared to be told that, hey Lou, you know what? You're not Stuyvesant material. Like, you're not good enough to be in this high school. And then you take that and like, okay, I'm going to find another way to make it through life without that. In the same way that I didn't get into Harvard or Yale or anything like that. So it's such I can't imagine being the young kid who gets into this school knowing that he's getting in because they've lowered standards. Like, I just can't
Well,
imagine.
in effect, what they do is they just usually lie about it. They usually don't, they're not fully open with the fact that they've changed standards. I saw an article in the Harvard Crimson, Harvard student newspaper, welcoming Harvard's new black freshman class, and it essentially just called it a myth that affirmative action lowers standards in order to get more black kids in, which led me to think, what do you think affirmative action is? That's the definition of it. I do want to go back to something you said, though. You said, if there is a minority that has been systemically
Right, that was a
oppressed,
sincere
how do
question.
we help? How do we help? To me, it's when you're talking about affirmative action at universities, it's not clear that you can make up for deficiencies in families and communities and rearing from 0 to 18 at 18.
Right.
So it's just not at all clear that you can intervene that late and fundamentally fix these underlying issues. So I think that is just assumed by many supporters of affirmative action, that you are giving people a human capital benefit by sending them to a college that they're not quite prepared for. But in many cases, you're doing the opposite because you're mismatching them with an institution where they're not going to flourish because kids had more preparation or are smarter or whatever. There was one study from the 80s at MIT that found that the typical black kid there was in the top 10% of math scores in the country, but the bottom 10% at MIT. So we're talking about very smart kids by any objective measure who would have done well at very good schools, just not MIT, who are there feeling stupid in every class, even though they're not stupid. They're just not MIT smart because of this policy that is designed to, quote, help them.
Yeah. De Blasio, one of the quotes that he said, can anyone defend this? Can anyone look the parent of a Latino or black child in the eye and tell them their precious daughter or son has an equal chance to get into one of their city's best high schools? Can anyone say this is the America we signed up for?
Equal to what?
Yeah,
That's the question
it's such a
there
weird.
also.
It's such a weird thing, and mismatch is a really interesting one. I know John McWhorter has talked about it, in particular of California, where they basically did away with affirmative action, and what they found was, I think black graduation rates went up significantly.
And GPA gap closed between blacks and whites almost entirely at, I think, UC San Diego. So the black kids were swimming among peers that were more like them at whatever level they happened to be at.
Because they were actually at the level wherever they happened to be at, rather than the one they got placed.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Well, we had another question that came in. Should schools be permitted to receive federal funds if they are discriminating against scientific researchers and pushing bogus science? I think that question might actually, also include kind of what we're talking about here too. If they are openly discriminating against students too, I wonder if that's a thing. What do you guys think?
Well, that's a tricky question because now the federal government has to determine whether that's even happening in the first place.
Right.
So it feels like either the federal funds need to be somehow given indiscriminately, and then it's decided at the school level whether that's happening, or nobody gets federal funding.
Right.
I don't know how the government is supposed to determine whether something's science or not.
It's kind of scary too because nowadays legitimate science is being called pseudoscience. So I would be a little bit skeptical. Like I don't think ideally the government should be funding obviously studies that are politicized, but nowadays I think it's so difficult for people who are in those positions making those decisions to really know, because both sides are saying, well, this is legitimate science, what I'm doing, and the other side is not doing legitimate science.
And then, and also, I think you run into a really tricky situation. I think a few years ago there was a Change.org petition, and granted, Change.org petitions aren't binding. Sorry, guys, you can write as many as you want. I'm still going to be here. All right. And the petition was to eliminate social justice courses in colleges. And it all comes down to, well, how do you define a social justice, course? Is it ultimately? It seems like it would be something that anyone who happens to disagree with what a professor is saying, that charge can be levied at them. So I think you get into a really, like I said, sticky situation there.
Right. I mean, in the end, you sort of just need to be able to have students and families choose where they send their kids to school, and ideally, yeah, in the ideal world, I don't know how it works in reality. Ideally, the classes that are teaching nonsense, kids don't want to take, and parents don't want to send their kids to. But how to practically apply that is another question.
I think I did. I think I just saw something on Twitter looking at the majors that have been most increasing in popularity recently and the ones that have been most decreasing. And I think the ones that have been most increasing in popularity tended to be the hard sciences that have been unaffected by progressive orthodoxies. So maybe people are voting with their feet.
Right.
Yeah. Cool. Here's one that I have for both of you guys. Since you've both written articles that may be deemed controversial and all that, and do you ever worry that your views or your findings might be used by bigots to justify their claims? Because I think that I usually see that argument as a reason for people shutting down certain conversations, saying, well, we don't even want to go there because it can be used to put people down or that sort of thing. Can you talk
Right.
about that?
I think it's important to call out both sides. That's my thing. So I stick to what the science says, and I'll get people on the left who get mad at me, and I get people on the right who get mad at me. So I think that's the way to do it, not to shut down the conversation entirely, because I feel like that's the direction that the far left is coming from, to say, well, these ideas could potentially be used to justify nefarious intentions or repugnant ideas. So we're not going to have that conversation at all. We're not going to legitimize those ideas. We're just not going to talk about it. And that doesn't solve the issue. I think so I'll say something like men and women are different biologically in the brain. And if your viewers watching this haven't seen the 10-part series that we did, they should, because it's pretty much an hour of me ranting about this and how gender is not a social construct. So that doesn't mean that women should go back to the kitchen, or that women are inferior and can't do math. So just to say both sides, to say there are these biological differences, but that's not a justification to say that women shouldn't be treated equally.
Also, some of the best chefs are men, so
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, I think similarly, I've made arguments to the effect that there are elements of black culture that are counterproductive and unique, and that people should be able to talk about openly and won't change unless we do. So if you take the past 10 seconds of my speech, there are white nationalists, white supremacists who would like that sentence, that would seem to fit into their worldview, that would seem to them to justify the need for some kind of white ethno-state or racial separatism. I think all of these are terrible ideas. But yeah, I mean, if you don't follow me for long enough, if you cherry pick me, you could definitely get readings of me that would seem to justify a far-right agenda. But if you do your homework, if you read the whole article, it's impossible to mistake me for any kind of far-right shill, I think, if you listen to me for long enough. I mean, I think if the rule for public discourse is that you can never say a sentence that can be taken out of context, then there will be no public discourse.
Right. We kind of talked about this earlier, that I had the question of we talked about last time here, the idea that somebody can say two sentences and they can be very similar, the same two sentences coming from, you know, a far right, like crazy racist person, and someone who's thoughtful on the right, and a far left person who's like out there, and somebody who's thoughtful on the left. And if you don't have the long form conversation, you can really easily just assume the worst in the person and take that to be their point of view and not have the conversation. I was saying, like, how do you have short form conversations? Your very realistic response was that you might not be able to.
I think it's really important to point that out, being willing to have those conversations. The other day, I posted something on Facebook, and I had people, you know, started commenting. I think it was something about like energy or something like that. And these two Facebook friends of mine got into a back and forth, and the one responded and said, "Hey man, I really don't care what you have to say. I don't have the time for it." And my response was, well, you know, I really wish that we would get to the point where you would say, "Hey, I might not know you, but I care enough about what you're saying that I'm engaging with you right now." Because it's almost like, if you aren't willing to have that engagement to begin with, then don't even start it.
Why'd you engage?
Why'd you engage? And I think just like social media and stuff just makes it so easy to just say whatever pops off in your head and then put it out there. And I know that I'm totally guilty of that. Like, most of that stuff should be, you know, put in a bottle and just thrown and hidden away for a long time. I mean, you guys are both very thoughtful. You're writers. You write long form pieces as well. How do you navigate, you know, sort of the Twitter sort of mindset with the work that you are doing? And you guys could take that.
Not very well.
Not well.
Yeah, I mean, I've never regretted not tweeting about something. I've only ever regretted tweeting about things,
Right.
which, if I were rational, would lead me to stop tweeting about things.
Like, I've never regretted not drinking. You know, like I've always regretted.
Is there a
like,
double negative in there, or
I always regretted not drinking.
you've never regretted not drinking? You've
Right.
never regretted like not getting drunk enough.
Yeah.
But you
yeah.
have regretted getting too
Oh
drunk.
yeah, yeah.
It's
Like
a similar
drunk and
effect.
tweeting.
Yeah.
Forget about
Ooh.
it.
Yeah,
Be over.
yeah.
How about yourself? Oh,
Sorry.
it's okay.
For me, I think I found it's gotten easier with time. When I first started writing, I was probably a little bit more afraid, I guess. I feel like people are just going to get upset. That's just the nature of being a columnist. And so I was saying to you earlier that I find it's the pieces that I think are totally rational and fine that people get really upset about, and the ones that I am not expecting backlash for, I am expecting backlash for, people don't get upset about. So it's a little bit unpredictable in some ways. But the same with social media. I think you take a good approach, Coleman, and to be, you know, thoughtful about it. And I generally try to not tweet if I feel frustrated, because I think even if you take the tweet down after, you don't know who screenshotted it, and it's taken out of context too.
Yeah, I sort of, you know, also it's sort of like, you guys are both public figures. Your work is out there. You know, there are consequences to what you put out. Like, you put an article out, you're going to have, you know, thousands of eyes on it. Whereas the people commenting don't necessarily have anything to lose, you know, by putting stuff out there. And I sort of liken it to, like, a while back, my dad was like talking shit about a UFC fighter, you know, and he was like,
Which one?
I don't even want to. No, I don't want to start shit between these two. He's like, he gave up. He's not good. You know, he gave up. He's a quitter. Blah blah blah. You know, and I'm thinking, like, and I was so upset because I have a tremendous amount of respect for these fighters, and then I realized, like, wait a minute, my dad's 68 years old. Like, he doesn't have to care. You know,
There's nothing to lose.
he's never, like, even if he was face to face with this guy, he's not going to do it. Like the fighter's not going to do anything to him. Now, if I had talked shit and I was face to face with the guy, then I would, you know, my neck would be, you know, off my head would be, you know, just off my body. His name was Cain Velasquez, too, one of the greatest heavyweight fighters out there. Cain, don't beat up my dad, please, man.
I feel like it's kind of a nice practice, though, like, not just to be a jerk, but like I primarily use Twitter for jokes. But sometimes you have a joke that somebody can read in a particular way that might upset somebody. it's kind of a nice practice doing it because it's also one of those things where the perceived harm is sometimes greater than the actual harm. And so it is that thing where you might keep quiet with certain perspectives because you're so used to hearing kind of extreme stories. It's hard to say how common they are when you hear about like the publicly shamed type of examples that happen. And I think a lot of times the fear of it is kind of greater than the actual risk. Like people have as many of the examples as there are of like, oh man, that's terrible, she lost her job because she took photos with a gravestone or whatever. There's also people that have, it's turned into conversation, and it could have been something that spiraled out, but it actually was a productive thing that, led to a conversation.
Yeah, I think sometimes people approach me and say that I'm brave, and obviously I want to accept it as a compliment,
Just
but at the
because you're
same
black?
time, just random people.
You were so brave
Being
to
a
be
black
walking
man
in
in
this
America.
neighborhood.
In America.
That's always the phrase, as a black man in America. There's always like, have you seen people repeat that? That's just
not
a
to me,
verbal
not to
tick
me.
that
I
gets
usually
on my
walk
nerves.
away way sooner.
It's like, I know you're in America. We're both in America right now. Why do you have to say it?
As a black man on vacation in, so.
What was that? So at the same, I want to accept the compliment, but at the same time, nothing bad has happened to me for writing my views. No one has tried to hurt me or anyone I care about. Like a lot of, like we see the worst examples, and the whole point of the worst examples is to make an example for the rest of us. It's like that scene in Pirates of the Caribbean where the British East India Trading Company hangs the corpse of the pirates and says, "The rest of you beware," right? It's like most of the pirates aren't getting hanged, but if you walk past and you see the corpse hanging there every day, it's a signal to the rest of you, don't become that guy. But the fact is, most people who do what that guy did get away with it. They don't get hanged. So I
Right.
think some courage is in order.
That's sort of like a Steven Pinker idea also, is that like we're more aware of all the bad examples of things. Like there might be less bad things happening, but because of the way things are now, they're also all very much like accessible to our everyday.
Yeah, well, I don't think people take stock enough in just how good things are compared to the way things used to be, whether it's, with all the gadgets we have and just how far we've come technologically and all that, but I think also with race relations too, I don't know if you guys would agree, disagree.
Well, yeah, I mean, you look at the polls of how many people would be happy if their kid married someone of a different race. It used to be like no one was happy about that as early as the 60s, or as recently as the 60s. Now it's like 10% at most. Alternatively, if you look at how happy people are having their kid marry someone of the opposing political party, that's skyrocketed to like 30, 40, 50%, to the point where I would say political bigotry is more of a poignant problem now than racial bigotry, at least by going off those polls. I know that, I've never encountered as much hate from a stranger for being black as I have for the political ideas I espouse, which is it definitely probably a unique feature of my bubble. So I could totally imagine someone in a different part of the country who gets more crap for being black than for whatever political views they have. But in the New York bubble and the Columbia bubble within the New York bubble, I definitely get treated worse as someone with some conservative ideas.
Boris, do you get treated badly because you're black?
I haven't noticed it.
Yeah, not yet.
Being black, I haven't noticed it. No, that's interesting because it also can get masked in the political in the same way that we mentioned earlier that you can be a traitor to your identity if you don't agree with somebody. So it's like technically they're not treating you differently because of your political beliefs, but it ends up being the race ends up being a mask for it almost. Like if you're a man and you feel different politically in this way, it's because you're a man. If you're a woman and you feel different political this way, it's because you've taken on the ideology of the thing that I am against, and it's brainwashed you. So it's kind of the race ends up being like a mask for the ideological difference.
There was a study that came out recently I wrote about. It found that non-white people actually have more of a problem with political correctness than white people. and it actually found that it's wealthy, well-educated, very progressive white people
Right,
who
I read
actually
that
think
also.
that political correctness is a good thing. And so it kind of becomes a question. Again, I do think many people have good intentions and are very empathic, but it's a question of, is this about actually solving issues, or is it about you making yourself feel good and looking good to the rest of society?
And making sure people agree with that, because that's the other thing, is that like there's a spectrum of like within the Overton window, as we describe it, of beliefs where like we can disagree about a bunch of this stuff, and if I grew up here and at this time and somebody else grew up on the other side of the country, there's a bunch of like morally perfectly fine disagreements to be had where you can sort of agree to disagree, as you'd say. And now I think it's becoming where like people on the left will attack other people on the left, where like you're agreed on 90% of this stuff, and yet this 10% you just can't accept that like you grew up on the border of Arizona, they grew up in Brooklyn. There's just a difference here that like you've had a bunch of life experience where this is just going to work differently for you guys, you know?
Yeah, I remember like people from Arizona talking about like 9/11, and it's like, I was in New York when it happened. Like, we're a little different.
Stay out of this.
Yeah, stay out of this, Arizona.
Stay out of my 9/11.
Yeah. But I'm being in New York, I've had the experience where can't tell you how many people who, you know, Democrats, liberals, who will come up to me and, well, then I know them. They don't just come up to me and be like, "You're so brave." No, they come up to me and they say, you know, they're like, "I feel really weird because I hold the same views I held 5 years ago, but now I'm not allowed to say some of those views, and I don't know what happened." And me, like you know, I'm the weirdo libertarian, so they're like, "I can talk to you about it." I'm like, "Yeah, I accept it." But it's weird being in that place where it's like, you know, I haven't really changed, and I think I'm a good person, but I can't express myself.
Yeah, I think there's definitely been a leftward push among Democrats. The New York Times, about a month ago, released some polling data, and they asked white liberals and black people on the whole the same question. And one of the questions was something like whether discrimination was the main reason why you see these statistical disparities between blacks and whites. And 79% of white liberals said yes, and only 60% of black people said yes, which meant that white liberals were significantly more woke than black people on the issue of systemic racism. I don't think that was true 10 years ago.
Yeah. That would be
that's
amazing
new.
if like that 78% figure is like, yeah, because we are discriminating against them. Like we are actively,
We're
part
doing it. We know for sure.
We are doing it. As we've been talking for a little bit, but there are a couple of things that I wanted to talk about. Deborah, can you explain to me what's happening with Twitter banning misgendering and dead naming people? Are you up on that? Because I just found that out, and I'm not sure what. I'm like, am I going to be kicked off soon if I make a mistake?
It's only a matter of time.
Right.
So I guess I'll start by defining misgendering. So when you misgender someone who's transgender, so say someone who was born male but identifies as female, it's referring to that person as male or with he pronouns, I guess, instead of feminine pronouns. And then dead naming is referring to someone, the name that they were given at birth, as opposed to the name that they've taken after transitioning. So there's been this trend on social media and blogs, and we're seeing it on Twitter more recently, of feminists being banned, suspended, and some of them permanently banned for misgendering transgender women. So there's this battle going on basically between radical feminists, who are called TERFs by trans activists. So TERF stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists, which means that they feel that
So
trans...
surf and turf. It's
Surf
very weird. Those are surfers, trans exclusionary radical feminists. They're radical because they surf.
Well, it'll be surf, S-E-R-F.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Surf
boy.
turfs. Sorry.
Yeah,
We
so
really,
it's okay.
really took that off the rails.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
It's
go
okay.
ahead.
So there's basically this battle happening between radical feminists and trans activists, because these feminists are saying that trans women are not the same as women who were born women, and so they should not necessarily be allowed in women's spaces, change rooms, bathrooms. More recently, they're being banned. I guess it's considered hate speech. I do see both sides I understand, like I don't consider myself to be a radical feminist. I think most radical feminists would definitely say I'm not one of them. But I do see what they're saying in that we can't have this conversation nowadays where women and girls are basically told, if you feel uncomfortable at all, that's too bad for you. Where we have cases where, say in Canada, there's a women's shelter. This woman shared a room. She was forced to share a room with a trans woman who was preoperative, so she still had male anatomy, and she was a victim of sexual assault. She also had issues with substances and trauma, and so she had to leave because she couldn't complain. And I think, in fact, complaining about it and saying I'm uncomfortable was considered a hate crime because she was acknowledging that her roommate was not born female. So, you know, this issue is very contentious. And I see the other side too, in that for trans women, of course, they deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. And I will use the pronouns that someone wants me to use, but I still think it's important that women not be basically thrown under the bus in the name of progressive and transgender rights.
There's also a lot of people on behalf of trans people that talk about the issue, or actually prevent speaking about the issue. And like, I think, honestly, one of the best contexts I've seen is we do roast battles in the city, and there's a couple trans comics that I'm friends with, and they'll do roast battles, and there'll be trans jokes, and there'll be jokes about everything else. And one of them, I don't want to mention by name, but like wrote a whole thing about how she had an altercation with somebody on a train, and was like, I handled it so much easier because I've been doing these roast battles, and I can take it, like your words are not going to hurt me and do this. And I think there's a lot of people who, you know, whether it's trans people or anybody else, on behalf of those people, avoid these conversations. And a lot of it is like, if you really empathize and you're trying to help people, there's a lot that we don't have figured out. Like, but part of this is biological science, part of it is psychology, and all these things that we don't yet have figured out. And how are we going to figure it out and help people better if you're automatically seen as a bigot, or, you know, can't even get to the place where you're discussing it in a way where, like, maybe we don't know all of this yet. Maybe there's some stuff left to figure out to help people better.
Yeah, a couple years ago, I had a conversation with a trans comic in LA, and it was around the bathroom controversy that was happening in the States. And she said, you know, with all this stuff happening, you know, for the first time, I'm being seen though, and we're being seen. And she meant it in a way of like, people are having this discussion, and finally, because I've been here, you know, and the part of having the discussion I found was so important, where I feel like shutting down the discussion, telling a woman, you can be uncomfortable, but don't talk about it, is, you know, basically limiting the opportunity for trans women to be able to say, like, I understand where you're coming from. Here's where I'm coming from. Maybe there's a dialogue that we can happen, and that we can actually take care of this thing, and bring more stuff to light and all that. Where I think just shutting it down is going to be more of a
It builds resentment.
Yeah.
It doesn't help to create understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all know in our personal lives people who constantly advertise their fragility to you, people who you learn to, censor yourself around because you know they have 10 or 20 issues that trigger them and set them off. And those are the people that you tend to hang out with less over time because they're just hard to be around. And I've been increasingly concerned with, so-called historically marginalized groups, which would include black people, it would include trans people, that there are spokesmen for these groups, generally self-appointed spokesmen, who are constantly advertising the most fragile possible. They're just putting out the most fragile version of the black identity or the trans identity, the version that is most sensitive and isn't really representative of the typical black person or typical trans person. And I think that's bad in the long term because you're basically setting yourself up to become the culture that every other culture censors themselves around, in the same way that there are people like that. And that's the kind of culture that other cultures don't want to emulate, don't want to be around. Like you say, it builds resentment. And I don't think that, I think those spokesmen should think very long and hard before they continue to just advertise the most fragile version of their culture.
Yeah, I did a video some time back about microaggressions, and basically the thesis was the best way to make sure you're not committing microaggressions is to not have anything to do with people of color or, you know, gay people or anything like that. Just sort of stay in your room and not deal with anybody, because you know, obviously it was in jest, but I think it sort of has to do with the point that.
But it's not totally in jest, because if you're an employer looking to hire someone, and you know, you see all this stuff happening in the news where, you know, an executive at Netflix says the N-word in a obviously anti-racist context, or non-racist context, I should say.
Yeah, I've only said the N-word with the best of intentions.
Yeah. And then gets fired for it. You see the same thing happening to the Papa John's guy, etc. And it could be rational from your point of view to hire a white person who's equally qualified over the black person, because you don't want to have a discrimination lawsuit on your hands.
Or you want to be able to say the N-word, pop off anytime you want.
That could be it too.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's not, yeah, I mean, again, like I hate the idea, and I know that this is happening, that, you know, a white person meets a black person and has this picture of what they may or may not be able to say, because they're seeing the self-appointed black spokesman on TV getting offended at everything, every single thing, no matter how small. And they're thinking, well, this person maybe speaks for a good amount of black people. This, you know, the New York Times presents this person as kind of a spokesman. So I'm just, you know, it's a barrier to true friendship, because I think most people know this from their best friendships are friendships where, like, you can push the boundary line with people and get very intimate psychologically. And, you know, it's often the most vulnerable things where you reveal things about yourself that aren't flattering, and that's how you get closer to people. And so I worry about the future of interracial friendship and relationship and the social fabric in general, if we are, as historically marginalized groups, advertising the most fragile versions of ourselves.
I remember that article in the New York Times about the father, black father, who was afraid of his kids being friends with white people, or he didn't want his kid to be friends with white people. And reading that was just sort of that was a tough one to read.
It was just racist. It was a racist article.
Yeah,
it
that
was,
might be the way.
It was a father telling his son, saying, in the New York Times, I teach my son not to befriend white kids. That's racist. I'm sorry. You can't just redefine racism to exclude that kind of thing and change the underlying immorality of the thing itself. Like, you could play this game with any word. You could redefine murder so that black people don't do it. Let's just call it killing when black people do it. Okay, fine. Doesn't make it any better.
It's
right?
Stabbing plus power.
Yeah, it's
murder equals
killing
stabbing plus power.
Exactly.
Systemic power.
I was going to say, you could say the same thing about trans activists, who are the loudest and they are the most aggressive and militant, but they don't represent the majority of transgender people or the community, I don't think.
I mean, also, some older trans people I know that have been in New York, they're very tough. Like, they've been around through so much macroaggressions and so much disrespect and discrimination that something like language, I mean, they're like much more abrasive is the wrong word, but like just they speak in a much more blunt way, like somebody who's been in New York for 40 years and not somebody who's making sure that everyone around them understands that they're an ally, you know?
Yeah, right on. Well, we've been going for a little while. I think we're gonna wrap things up. I want to thank everyone who joined me today on the panel. I want to thank you guys for checking us out and giving us some of your questions. Sorry I didn't get to all of them, but hopefully the next one we'll be able to get to those. Do you guys want to plug some stuff?
Yes, so I write a weekly column for Playboy.com that is safe for work. I write a monthly column for the Globe and Mail, which is Canada's national newspaper.
Not safe for work.
And I'm on social media at Dr. Debra Soh on Twitter and Facebook, Dr. Debra W. Soh on Instagram, and I will be featured in the December 2018 issue of Penthouse, which is actually coming out tomorrow.
Coleman?
I'm a columnist at Quillette. I write a monthly column there. You can check it out. My Twitter handle is @ColdXman.
Twitter handle is @the_Boris_K. I'm a comic. If you're in New York, you can come check me out. And December 16th, I'm hosting a late night style show with Goosebumps author R.L. Stein
Whoa.
and Andrea Belke from Survivor. Should be really cool.
How did that
People
happen?
should check it out.
That's awesome.
Yeah, my producer got him on.
Look at that. Great. And I'm Lou Perez with We the Internet TV. Please, guys, subscribe, share our stuff. We're on Patreon. If you want to give a little bit back. Much appreciated. And if I don't see you before the holidays, have a great time. And tell your family how you feel about them. And tell me what you think of the suit. That was a terrible thing to ask for. I think we're done. We're good? All right.